At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the French army outnumbered the English by somewhere between 2 and 3 to 1. They had knights, the most expensive, most trained, most heavily armored fighting men in the world. They had crossbowmen. They had momentum, territory, and the will to fight. And within the space of a single afternoon, that army ceased to exist as a fighting force. Not because the English killed them all, because the French broke. Crécy is a famous story. But the part that usually goes untold is this. What happened at Crécy happened at almost every medieval battle that ended decisively. The killing was not what decided it. The running was. Medieval soldiers didn't die in battle. They ran from it. And understanding why, understanding the precise mechanics of how and when medieval armies collapsed, reveals something about how this warfare actually worked that no sword, no siege engine, no tactical formation quite explains on its own. This video argues one thing, that the decisive factor in medieval battle was not firepower, not armor, not numbers. It was the psychological moment of collapse. Medieval commanders understood this. They planned for it, provoked it, and exploited it with a sophistication we rarely credit them with. The sword ended individual lives. Fear ended armies. And the greatest military minds of the medieval period knew that engineering the moment of mass flight was the real objective, not the fighting that preceded it. To understand why medieval soldiers ran, it helps to start with a number that military historians have puzzled over for a long time. The casualty figures from medieval battles are almost always asymmetric in a way that defies expectation. At Crécy, contemporary estimates, which must always be treated with caution since medieval chroniclers were not statisticians, suggest the French lost somewhere in the region of 1,500 knights alone, with total French dead running into several thousand. Scholars disagree on the precise figure. Estimates range from around 5,000 to as high as 12,000. English losses are recorded as a fraction of that, almost certainly in the low hundreds. At Agincourt in 1415, the casualty imbalance followed the same pattern. The exact numbers remain genuinely contested. Modern historians have revised army sizes significantly downward from the dramatic traditional figures, but what is not contested is this. French dead ran to several thousand, English dead to several hundred. The ratio is not a legend. It is documented on both sides. These numbers are contested. Scholars have argued about them for generations, but the pattern they reveal is not contested at all. Medieval battles that ended decisively tended to end with catastrophic losses concentrated almost entirely on one side, and that pattern has a single consistent explanation. The killing happened in the rout. When a medieval army held its formation, when the line was intact, shields were up, and men were fighting back, casualties on both sides accumulated slowly. Medieval armor, even at its most basic, was designed for exactly this, absorbing punishment while keeping a man alive and fighting. A professional soldier in the 11th century, wearing a mail hauberk and carrying a shield, was not easy to kill quickly. He could absorb a blow, step back, recover. His neighbors covered his flanks. The formation, as long as it held, was a collective defense mechanism. The moment the formation broke, the moment one part of the line decided that the situation was lost and turned to run, that protection vanished entirely. A man running from a battlefield had his back to the enemy. He could not use his shield. He could not see the blow coming. He was, in the clinical language of military historians, undefended, and the pursuers knew it. Mounted knights, whose horses gave them 3 or 4 times the speed of a man on foot, could ride down fleeing infantry almost at will. The killing that produced those lopsided casualty figures was not the killing of the battle. It was the killing of the pursuit. It was the harvest that followed the breaking of the line. This is why medieval casualty figures look the way they do. Not because one side was dramatically better at fighting, because one side broke first, and in breaking, transformed the contest from a battle into a slaughter. The question then is not who won the fighting, it is who triggered the breaking. And that takes us somewhere that medieval military history rarely goes, into the psychology of the men standing in those lines, weighing a calculation they would never have articulated, but were performing constantly. In 1976, a military historian named John Keegan published a book called The Face of Battle that reshaped how scholars approached the study of warfare. Keegan's argument was deceptively simple. Instead of studying battles from the perspective of commanders and their strategies, he studied them from the perspective of the individual soldier and asked what that soldier could actually see, hear, and decide in the chaos of a medieval engagement. His central contention was that the individual medieval soldier was not, in any meaningful sense, a participant in the battle as a whole. He could not see most of it. He could hear noise, the crash of weapons, the screaming of horses, the shouting of men near and far, but he could rarely interpret it accurately. He did not know, standing in the middle of a line, whether his side was winning or losing. He He knew only what was happening within a few feet of where he stood. This created a particular kind of psychological pressure. Every man in a medieval battle line was running a continuous calculation, whether he knew it or not. Is the cost of staying lower than the cost of leaving? While the men around him were holding, while the line felt solid, the calculation was relatively straightforward. Desertion in the face of the enemy carried severe penalties in most medieval armies. Execution was not unusual, and a man who left the line alone was vulnerable in ways that a man in formation was not. Staying was rational, but that calculation was sensitive to signals, and the most important signals were not the ones that told a soldier the battle was lost. They were the ones that told him other men thought the battle was lost. This is what military psychologists now call threshold contagion, the idea that panic in a formation spreads not because every man independently concludes the situation is hopeless, but because men watch each other and update their own assessments based on what they see their neighbors doing. One man turns to run. The man next to him sees it, and his calculation shifts. If he's leaving, perhaps he knows something I don't. He turns. The man on the other side sees two men running. His threshold is lower than if he'd seen one. He turns, and within seconds, what started as one man's individual decision becomes a wave that moves through an army faster than any command can counter it. The medieval commanders who understood this, and the evidence suggests that the best of them understood it very clearly, recognized that winning the battle and triggering the rout were two different objectives. Fighting well got you through the first. Engineering the signal that triggered mass flight got you the second, and it was the second that ended wars. The signal could come from almost anywhere. A rumor spreading through the ranks that the commander had been killed, the sight of a banner going down, a flank crumbling, a reserve unit that never appeared. What mattered was not whether the signal was accurate. What mattered was whether enough men believed it at the same moment. The commanders who appeared to win battles through tactical genius were often doing something more precise than tactical genius. They were creating the conditions for a specific psychological moment, at a specific point in the line, at a specific time. The fighting was the means. The collapse was the end. In August of 1138, a remarkable thing happened at a place called Cowton Moor in Yorkshire, England. An English army facing a Scottish invasion under King David I erected in the center of their formation a ship's mast mounted on a cart from which hung the banners of three saints, Peter of York, John of Beverley, and Wilfrid of Ripon. The battle that followed became known as the Battle of the Standard. The English won decisively. The ship's mast was not a weapon. It was a psychological instrument. Its purpose was not to harm the Scottish army. Its purpose was to anchor English resolve, to give every man in the English formation a fixed point of reference that told him at a glance that the line was still holding. As long as the standard stood, the battle was not lost. The banner could not fall. It could not be killed. And in a formation where the central fear was that everything was collapsing around you, a banner that could not collapse was worth more than 100 swords. This logic was understood on the offensive side just as clearly. The systematic targeting of enemy commanders, and specifically of enemy command signals, was a feature of sophisticated medieval military thinking long before it was written down in treatises. Kill the commander, or better yet, let it be seen that the commander has fallen, and the calculation running through every man in the enemy formation shifts instantly. At the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the most contested moment of the entire engagement is the question of whether Harold was killed by an arrow before the English line broke, or whether the line broke first and Harold died in the subsequent collapse. Historians have argued about this for nearly 1,000 years, but both versions of the story share the same essential structure. The death of the king, or the rumor of it, was the signal that ended English resistance. Whether the arrow came first or the rout came first, the two events were inseparable in their effect. William of Normandy understood this. During the battle, there was a moment where his own forces began to break. A rumor swept the Norman line that William had been killed. He rode without his helmet to the front of his own formation so that his men could see his face, could see he was alive, could recalibrate their threshold calculation in real time. The battle, by most accounts, hung on that moment, not on the fighting, on the signal. Banners, war cries, the deliberate targeting of enemy officers, the fabrication of retreat to draw an enemy out of formation. These were not peripheral features of medieval battle. They were central to how commanders thought about winning. Every one of them was designed to produce or prevent the same outcome, the moment where the signal reached a critical mass of men simultaneously and the army stopped being an army. Of all the tactics designed to trigger a rout, the feigned retreat is perhaps the most sophisticated and the most demanding. It requires an army to pretend it is breaking, wait for the enemy to believe it and give chase, then turn and destroy the pursuers while they are disordered and vulnerable. It weaponizes the psychology of flight against the men it it is meant to deceive. It also requires a level of discipline that most military historians once assumed was beyond medieval armies. The assumption, which persisted in popular history well into the 20th century, was that medieval warfare was essentially a chaotic melee. Brave men hacking at each other with minimal coordination, won by whoever had more men or more courage. The feigned retreat demolished that assumption wherever it appeared in the record. At Hastings, the Norman cavalry executed what appears to have been a feigned retreat, possibly twice. The English, holding the high ground and the security of a tight shield wall, broke formation to pursue what looked like fleeing horsemen. The Norman cavalry turned. The English who had given chase were cut down in open ground, away from the protection of the formation they had abandoned. Whether the first retreat was genuinely feigned or genuinely panicked and Norman discipline recovered it remains debated. The second is harder to explain as accident. The tactic appears in a different form at the Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097 during the First Crusade, where Seljuk Turkish cavalry used it with devastating effect against Crusader forces who had not yet learned to resist the bait. It appears in the Mongol military repertoire, used with such consistency and precision that commanders explicitly trained their formations to hold ground against apparent flight. The feigned retreat was not a Norman invention, not a Turkish speciality, not a Mongol peculiarity. It was a tactic that emerged independently across centuries and continents, wherever commanders understood the same underlying truth. The underlying truth was this: an army in pursuit is an army that has already psychologically broken its own formation. The men who chase a fleeing enemy are not thinking about holding the line. They are thinking about killing. Their shields are at their sides, not in front of them. Their spacing has opened up. Their commanders cannot see them, cannot direct them, cannot stop them if the situation changes. They have done voluntarily what the enemy was trying to force on them by force. The commanders who used the feigned retreat were not just tactically clever. They were reading the psychology of their opponents with precision. They knew the sight of fleeing men would trigger something, an instinct to pursue, to finish the job, to claim the victory that looked certain, and they built their plan around that instinct, not despite it. This is what separates the medieval commanders who won decisively from those who merely fought well. Fighting well was common enough. Winning decisively required understanding what it would take to make the enemy's army stop being an army, and then engineering exactly that, on a chosen piece of ground, at a chosen moment. There is a word in medieval military accounts that appears with a frequency that is almost uncomfortable to read once you understand what it means. The word is fugum, the Latin for flight. Medieval chroniclers, who wrote in Latin as a matter of course, recorded the moment of rout with this word, often in the passive voice, as though it were a natural event rather than a human catastrophe. Fugum dederunt, they gave flight, they turned and ran. What followed fugum in the chronicle accounts was almost invariably the same: pursuit, killing, the numbers that produced those asymmetric casualty figures. A battle that had been, for hours, a disciplined and murderous contest between two organized forces became, in the space of minutes, a chase. The fleeing soldiers were not fighting anymore. The pursuing soldiers were barely soldiers either. They were hunters, moving as fast as their horses or legs could carry them, killing men who could not defend themselves. The killing that produced those casualty ratios at Crécy and Agincourt and dozens of other medieval engagements was almost entirely this kind of killing. Not the killing of battle, where a man could block, parry, retreat, and survive another minute. The killing of collapse, where a man's back was turned and a horseman was closing behind him at speed. The medieval military mind understood something about this that we rarely articulate. Battles were not fought to destroy the enemy. They were fought to create the conditions for pursuit. The fighting was the preamble, the rout was the mechanism, and the pursuit was the moment where the arithmetic shifted so dramatically that a smaller, less well-equipped force could destroy a larger one almost completely. This also explains something about how medieval commanders made decisions after a battle broke in their favor. The chronicles record, repeatedly, the difficulty of calling off a pursuit, of getting cavalry who were actively killing to stop, regroup, and return. At Bannockburn in 1314, at Crécy, at Poitiers in 1356, the English and Scottish commanders who won those battles faced the same problem. How do you impose discipline on an army that is winning? The men in pursuit were not disobeying orders out of bloodlust alone. They were following the internal logic of the rout. The time for killing was now, while the enemy could not fight back. The rout, once started, had its own momentum, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it. It was not just a decision made by frightened men. It was a mechanism that, once triggered, was almost impossible to stop on either side. The medieval battlefield was not primarily a contest of weapons. It was a contest of psychological thresholds, a competition to determine which army would reach first, the tipping point where enough men believed the battle was lost, that they stopped fighting as a unit and became, instead, a collection of individuals running for their lives. The weapons, the armor, the tactics, the formations, all of these were instruments in that contest. None of them were the contest itself. What this means is that the commanders who shaped medieval warfare were not, at their core, weapons specialists or logistical geniuses, though the best of them were both. They were psychologists. They read formations for signs of wavering. They cultivated the display of strength not because strength alone won battles, but because the perception of strength delayed the threshold moment in their own men and advanced it in the enemy's. They kept their banners flying not for ceremony, but because a banner that could not fall was telling 10,000 men simultaneously that the calculation still favored staying. We have spent centuries studying medieval warfare through the lens of its weapons and its tactics. Those are real and important. But the thing that ended medieval battles, the mechanism that turned disciplined armies into fleeing crowds, that produced the lopsided casualty figures, that determined who controlled the field by nightfall, was something no sword could produce and no armor could stop. It was the moment when enough men, in the same instant, decided that staying was no longer worth it. Medieval commanders who understood that moment, who could create it in the enemy and prevent it in their own men, won. The ones who didn't understood war as a physical contest. The ones who did understood it as something closer to what it actually was, a competition of nerve, perception, and the management of collective fear. If this changed how you think about how medieval battles were actually decided, hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel grow. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and what you want to see in next video. Thank you for watching. Next video.